I would like to start with some common accusation that Islam is just Arabic culture and that Islam sees Arabs superior to other ethnicities, which is beyond any reason and easily disproved. This is something that is explored in more detail in The Sealed Nectar by Ar-Rahiq al-Maktoum. While it is true that certain aspects of Arabic culture can be seen in Islamic culture, it is far-fetched to say that Arabic and Islamic culture are the same. The thing is that the Prophet was just not a prophet but a revolutionary, not only introducing a religion, but an entire new culture. There are multiple reasons for that, and I'm not gonna go into too much detail, but basically, prior to Islamic revelation, first, women were seen as objects. It was not uncommon to hear about people burying their daughters alive because they were seen as a disgrace and as a financial burden. After the Islamic revelation, this obviously changed for the better, but I will come to that in the rights of women part. This is like the first major break from Arabic culture. Second, being of specific Arabic tribes meant a lot and gave you more worth as a human, especially considering the slave economy of the Arabic world, but I will come to the slave topic later on. After the Islamic revelation, all humans were given equal value. To underline this, the first muezzin, the person that calls people to prayer, was honored a black man and a former slave named Bilal. Third, in the Arabic culture it was common to inherit all women from your father. After your father's death, all women would be married to you, including your mother, which I'm not 100% sure if it was like that, but all concubines of your father were for sure yours. After Islam, this did not only got reduced to 4, consent by women came into play as well as extra condition for further marriage in general. Fourth, people of the Islamic belief were seen as part of the Ummah, as one people to speak, and were forbidden to wage war against each other. Prior to Islamic revelation, it was common to raid your neighbor. It was a livelihood of many families and tribes. Islam made it into a taboo, and not only to Muslims, but non-Muslims as well, but I will get there at the jihad part. Fifth, alcohol was banned entirely from society. A short disclaimer, not banned, but I will get there at the later part of the video series. But basically, the consumption was heavily discouraged, so to speak. And before you say it's just alcohol, alcohol is an integral part of German culture, identity, and society. It's not just alcohol, but an entire industry, way of living, and social acceptance to what is alright and what isn't. 6. Hygiene suddenly plays a gigantic role. It's, for example, your duty to wash certain parts of your body 5 times a day before prayers. It's also your duty to wash yourself after sexual intercourse, and so on. Lastly, Islam encourages, partially even forces you to be caring for your surrounding, which the Arabic people prior to Islam couldn't care less. Forcing in the sense of it's your duty to give money for charity as a Muslim, as an example. Now obviously there is much more to Arabic culture than the things I've mentioned here, but generally speaking, Islamic culture eradicated Arabic culture and replaced it. You might have replaced Arabic culture first, but this does not translate into Islamic culture suddenly being solely and only Arabic. To put matters into perspective and to give you a better understanding in regards to what I mean, our current worldview and ideology is shaped by the French Revolution. National consciousness, nationalism, self-governing of ethnicities and whatnot have their origin in the French Revolution. We view ourselves as part of a nation because of the French Revolution, and national borders were, at least in Europe, drawn according to the ideas of the French Revolution, with certain exceptions. Yet despite the world-changing perspective, the entity of humanity got, most of us are, thank the Lord, not French. The same way the Prophet changed human society with the Islamic world forever without introducing a specifically Arabic culture. Or a simpler example, it's like the Mongols becoming their own culture and identity after Genghis Khan and not prior. Either way, you can see from these examples, some of which will become clearer later on, that we have an utter change of culture and identity with Islam. This is not a continuation or reformation of Arabic culture, but a break from Arabic culture. Now let's get to the rights of women. Since people commonly accuse the religion of oppressing women, and granted, there's a lot of oppression going on in the Islamic world, in particular against women, but there's a difference between what is enforced by the religion and what is done due to ignorance or culture. And before we get into details, I have to point out some historic stuff in order to get an idea of the times and what was done due to lack of statehood and what was done due to religion. As mentioned before, prior to Islam, women were seen as objects, and that this changed after the introduction of the religion. What I mean with that, back then there were still a lot of wars with only men fighting, resulting in an influx of widows and a lack of men within the state. Since the Arabs used to live among tribes, an Arabic state did not exist as a whole and not in the shape it did with the first caliphate. Meaning, a widow was not taken care of by the state, but by families, or worst case, not at all. Since Islam is about compassion and taking care of people, the influx of widows and the lack of men were solved by encouraging people to marry widows in order to take care of them. This could only happen with consent. Binti Kutam, for example, became a widow. Her father forced her into a marriage she did not want, so she went to the Prophet and the Prophet revoked it. I will expand on this a bit more later on, but basically what you have to keep in mind here is that a state as we have today with social institutions did simply not exist, and the solution for the social issues were found in polygamy. By the way, consent also plays an important role with war prisoners, or to be more specific, wives of war prisoners, of polytheists, fallen enemy warriors. They were back then forced into marriage by the polytheists, and they were given the opportunity to join the Muslim community through marriage, if they wish to do so. This is not equal to a woman being lower than a man in status. But if this is all about taking care of people, then why was sex involved? Contrary to today, sex back then was not seen as an act of love, but as a human necessity. People understood that other people can feel deprived of sexual intercourse, and denying people the fulfillment of sexual needs goes against the very nature of being a human. Sex was just seen as something else. It was less of a big deal than it is today. However, there is, according to Islam, a thin but sharp line between decency and hedonism, in this case, sexual and physical hedonism. Either way, people were encouraged to marry early and widows if possible. However, this is not equal to a wife not having a say in this matter. If the first wife fears that her husband cannot treat additional wives with justice, then she is in her full right to object the marriage. This is covered in 127 to 130. It also opens the question, is such a system still necessary in this day and age? Since the concern was to take care of people back then, I would say no. Unless the state about which we're talking about is not able to take care of widows. In countries like Germany, I don't believe there's a need for polygamy. But when we are talking about, let's say, Somalia, I think there's a fair point to make about polygamy within the frame of justice. But Sefa, if this was all about consent and taking care, why are women forced to cover themselves? Well, first things first, we have to look at the verse and the circumstances it was revealed. When the revelation of the Quran happened, people may or may not have worn a, let's say, headscarf. There were no comments about it. However, as time passed and the Muslim community grew, the amount of bullying, harassment, and degeneracy also grew towards Muslims. When, for instance, women left their home in dark hours to do their business, like, taking a shit, the polytheists would follow, peek, or straight up run to the woman and excuse themselves with, sorry, I thought you're my slave, wife, sister, whatever else. I didn't know it was you. As a result, women were told to cover themselves in order to send the message, we Muslim women do not harass, follow, or bully us. And this did work to a certain extent. The covering, as in piece of clothes over the head, became not just a symbol of identification, but a symbol of independence and equality. And the following verse should be understood within this context. So covering was never about preventing the stares of men, but primarily to protect women from harassment. Now one might say, is that still relevant today? I would say, definitely. Just ask a half-decent looking woman how often she gets harassed on her public social media account, and you will get the answer. Regardless of faith or non-religion, there are still enough men that are complete degenerates. Would a headscarf, however, really protect them from harassment in this day and age? I will tell you about two cases. Case number 1, this happened to a mother of an acquaintance of mine in Germany. She bought some stuff from the mosque, and on her way out, a random dude pulled her headscarf, said something along the lines of bad Muslims, and ran away. So she was targeted because of the headscarf. Case number 2, I'm not gonna say who this is, but this involves a woman from an Islamic country. She got constantly harassed because of her looks, so she decided to wear a headscarf in order to stop the harassment. It had the contrary effect. Men started to harass her even more. They started to get closer and whisper stuff into her ear, which did not just render the headscarf useless, it was also quite humiliating for her. And lastly, if you know who this person is, you also know why she got famous. Men are fetishizing over the headscarf. The initial purpose is entirely lost. So should we stop covering ourselves? Well, frankly speaking, I have no idea. I think this is a really tough question. I don't think there is an easy solution to this. I would understand both arguments from both sides. And all I could recommend is to wear what you perceive as decent enough to minimize harassment. However, men will stare regardless of what you wear. And before I get comments, of course it's not all men, I know of them, alright? No one is accusing you, alright. But what about marriage? Often men just possess over their wives and control them. Some even go as far as to take their money from them. And these cases do happen. I'm not here to claim that it doesn't. But it does not happen because of the religion, but despite the religion. Islam is pretty clear about, for instance, earnings. In fact, according to Islamic understanding, the husband is the only person with financial responsibilities for the family, not the wife. A husband is obligated to earn and fulfill the needs of his wife and children. Which brings me to gender roles. A wife can, according to Islamic understanding, earn whatever she wants to and not contribute to the household. It's not her duty. She is, however, supposed to take care of children. It's also the reason why men are getting more out of heritage than women. In case of two siblings, one male, one female, a male would get 2/3 of the inheritance because he has financial responsibilities, the woman doesn't. This case did apply for thousands of years, up until 80 years ago. This still applied. Nowadays, in more industrialized countries, there are obviously more opportunities. In Germany, for instance, you even have the chance to take vacation as a man in order to take care of your child, so your wife can return to work, sharing the responsibilities of raising a child, which is something wonderful. The point, as far as I know, there is no verse that specifically identifies gender roles within the Quran, and as such, it's up to society itself in regards to dealing with this topic. In most parts of the world, the idea of men working and women taking care of the household still applies. This is the reality a lot of, if not most, human families are in. I think if you are a sibling of two with one male and one female, it's fair to give the lion's share of the inheritance to the son if the daughter doesn't work and her husband is taking care of her. This obviously doesn't apply to most cases, and especially in the middle class nowadays, both partners have to work in order to make ends meet. So I would argue that nowadays a share of 50% for each is the right thing to do. Sefa, all of this sounds very fancy, but isn't it right that you can beat your wife if she is disobedient? Let's put aside the fact that the Prophet said multiple times not to beat your wife. There's one particular case where you can discipline your wife, but before I get there, let's first talk about the steps and the circumstances. Let's say you live in medieval Arabia. There is no police or social institution. You go to work, you come home, you end up seeing your wife beating your children. According to Islam, step 1 is to talk to her and to urge her to change her ways. You go to work, you come back, you see her still beating your children. Step 2 is to avoid sexual intercourse / avoid her in bed until she changes her ways. 2 weeks pass, the same happens. You're in this case allowed to physically discipline your wife, but not in a way that leaves marks. It's supposed to be done more like a father that disciplines his child. It's supposed to be symbolic, more like waking someone up rather than physically hurt. And only if talking and avoiding her in bed is not working at all. Nowadays, we obviously have much more options before we even get close to considering hitting someone, symbolic or not. We have institutions like the police. We can consider our family members and friends to urge her as well, and worst case, we can even get full custody over our children. This particular case only makes sense if you live in a stateless environment where the utter defiance of authority has no consequences. So randomly beating your wife because she didn't make you coffee is against the entire philosophy of the religion. You're meant to protect and care for each other in a marriage. It's supposed to be about completing and helping where the other side lacks. There's also a link I'm going to drop that further explores this topic and leaves more references. Lastly, I have to lose some words about polygamy in case of the Prophet. Well, first things first, critical people about Islam are quick to act like the Prophet had a harem of young women he just wanted to F around with, which could not be further from the truth. The first wife, Khadija, of the Prophet was a widow, but not only a widow, but a successful businesswoman. She had 2 past marriages already and 2 children from her previous marriages before she married to the Prophet. It was also her offering the marriage to the Prophet and not the other way around. She was older than the Prophet and fell in love with him. The Prophet back then was working for her, or at least did work for her, and he accepted the marriage. The marriage lasted 25 years until she died of old age. She was not just a wife to the Prophet, but a trusted friend he can seek refuge to when he required. When the archangel Gabriel came to the prophet and demanded him to read, he was so terrified that he sought refuge by Khadija's side. It was her encouraging him to accept Gabriel and his command as a divine revelation, and after her death, he was in shambles. He was sad, depressed, losing not a wife but his best friend. After a period of time of seclusion and grieving, it was not the prophet going around to seek more wives, but Gwala bin Hakim, a female companion of the prophet, saying, "O God's messenger, I see that you have secluded yourself after the loss of Khadijah. Shall I not find a match for you?" The prophet asked who, and she replied, "If you want, both an unmarried and a divorced lady are available." The prophet asked who the unmarried one was. She replied, "Aisha, the daughter of your dearest friend Abu Bakr." The prophet asked who the other one was. She said, "Sawada bin Zama, who has professed faith in you and follows your religion." The prophet agreed. Sawada, the second wife of the prophet, was at his age. She was also a divorced woman. Aisha, on the other hand, stayed for 4 years at her father's side until she was old enough to take care of the household by herself. It was agreed with Sawada that she would only take care of the prophet until Aisha is able to take care of the household, but she wanted to stay married to the prophet and he agreed. The prophet was 55 when Aisha arrived. There are several things to take out of all of this. First, the marriage up until this point are not happening because the prophet is going around demanding people to give him F-buddies. It's just not the case. Second, if you're a Muslim and you want to follow the prophet, then clearly and obviously monogamy is the way to go. 25 years of marriage is nothing that can or should be ignored. I will come to the other marriages later on. Third, Aisha's age is disputed, but it is commonly agreed upon that she had sexual intercourse when she was a teen. As mentioned, sex had a completely different implication back then. It was only about human desires that had to be fulfilled, and before you pull the trigger and start calling people a pedophile, up until 150, 200 years ago, this was quite common among human societies. The moment a female entered puberty, she was married off, even in Europe, regardless of the age gap between female and male. This changed slowly through the industrialization with many opportunities is brought. So just because nowadays we view things differently, it doesn't mean that we are at the morally high ground. This is also not equal to Islam demanding that you have to marry off people the moment they enter puberty. Fourth, the sacredcy of virginity is entirely irrelevant in Islam. Obviously, sexual intercourse before marriage is wrong according to Islamic principles, but it's not like you're not meant to marry or that you should or can only marry virgins. Fifth, it's important to note that the Prophet lived through a lot of hardship at this point. Khadijah did not just die of natural causes. The hardship the Muslim community went through had a toll on her body. She could have likely lived longer if it wasn't for the marches, the war, the harassment she had to endure. This also took a toll on the Prophet's body, which is why his companion suggested another marriage in the first place. He required someone to help him out with the household. 6. All of this is happening with consent. You could argue that Aisha did not know it better, but the Prophet offered all of his wives a divorce if they wished to and plenty of fortune so they wouldn't have to worry about anything either. All of his wives refused the offer. So the accusation of doing stuff without their consent was expressed back then as well and clarified with this option that was refused. Now after this, in his remaining 8 years of his life, he married 8 more times. It would get too long going into details with all of it, but basically each marriage after this was either to take care of someone who lost their support, aka their husband, or in order to teach his people that certain marriages are alright, or in order to establish something. Other marriages were, for example, more political in nature and happened because he was the leader of the Ummah. Just as one example to all of this, his paternal cousin Zainab Rasulullah married a former slave and the adopted son of the Prophet. The marriage failed, she got divorced, and in order to show that divorced women can marry and that the adoption of his son is not equal to a real son, he married Zainab Rasulullah with her consent. This is an extremely specific case, and the Prophet knew that he didn't have much to live, so he did the marriage regardless of the 4 wives rule, of which the Prophet was exempted anyways. Either way, I noted the ages of the wives just in case anyone was curious with some extra notes. Sources are conflicting and some dates are not right. For example, in Turkish sources it's commonly said that Aisha was a teen when she married, at least 15. The time she had sexual intercourse would make it to roughly 17 to 19 or something, which is deep inside the frame of what we see as alright in our postmodern times. Just as a reminder and a side note, according to German law, you can, as an adult, have sex with a 14-year-old as long as no manipulation or money is involved here. Not that I would support this idea, but it is still legal. So times and perspectives really did change in the last 100 or so years. Some might argue, sure, but manipulating teens is easy. So is it easy to manipulate adults? Just recently, a woman from Japan was tricked to give $30,000 to a trickster whom she thought was stuck in space. Either way, the ages of his wives are all over the place. There's really no evidence to claim that the prophet was a pedophile, especially when conflicting sources are available and when the vast majority of Islamic scholars argue that marriage is permissible when people are in puberty and mature and wealthy enough to uphold a marriage on their own. However, I know that some people will exclusively look at Aisha with sources stating that she was 9 or even 6 when she married, and maybe Safiya, and claim that the prophet was just out of the blue turned into a pedophile that wanted to have a harem, which makes absolutely and definitely sense when we consider his 25-year-long marriage with an older woman that absolutely devastated him when she died. Sarcasm, in case you didn't notice. Either way, all of these marriages happened with consent, and all wives were given the opportunity to divorce the prophet if they wished to do so. This is even the case with Raihana, where some sources state that she was married to the prophet and divorced him later on.